Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. As you can see, it's party time Beach Boys style here in the basement as we take an in-depth look at the Beach Boys' late 1965 release, recorded live at a Beach Boys party. We're all familiar with the cliche that if you remember the 60s, you probably weren't there. And this seems particularly apt in the case of Beach Boys' party, where I found a lot of contradictory information about the details of the recording, often from the same people at different times. One thing that everybody seems to agree on is that the Beach Boys party was a stopgap measure. By the middle of 1965, the Beach Boys had already released two excellent albums, Beach Boys Today and Summer Days and Summer Nights. They'd had three major hit singles, including the #1 Help Me Rhonda. And for any other band at any other time, it might have meant a break, but not so for the Beach Boys. Capitol Records was eager to get a Christmas release out for 1965, and they expected something more from the Beach Boys before the end of the year. Good ideas for Christmas time releases, of course, are live albums and Christmas albums. And the Beach Boys, unfortunately, had done both these things the prior year, 1964, so they were kind of left without an obvious idea. Apparently, a greatest hits package was discussed, and sometimes the greatest hits package gives the impression that the best days are behind them. This certainly didn't seem to be the case with the Beach Boys, so that idea was quickly nixed. So what to do? Brian was in the early stages of recording what would become Pet Sounds and was not inclined to try to do another studio album before the end of the year. So somebody somewhere hit on this idea of doing a series of informal, mostly acoustic recordings with a party-type atmosphere. And here is our first contradiction. Sources vary wildly on whose idea this actually was. Mike Love says he thought of it. At various times, Brian has concurred. Yeah, Mike thought of it. At other times, Brian said that he thought of it. At one point, he said he thought of it while playing volleyball on the beach. In any case, it may have been, at least in part, inspired by the recent live hits by Johnny Rivers. He had had 5 top 20 hits over the last year, including Memphis, Mountain of Love, and Seventh Son. His records were billed as being live, often at the Red Hot Whiskey A Go-Go Club on the Sunset Strip, where he was sort of artist in residence from the time the place opened in January 1964. Parts of his albums may have been recorded live, but more likely, the hits at least, seem pretty clearly to be live in the studio with audience effects added in. I understand that most of Johnny Rivers' hits were actually recorded at the Beach Boys' favorite studio, Western Recorders on Sunset, using some of the same studio musicians, known as the Wrecking Crew later on, that Brian Wilson favored for his recordings. So Brian not only would have been aware of these as hits, he would have had a pretty good insight probably into how they were actually made. In any case, I can certainly see why this approach may have appealed to Brian as a producer. You could relax a little bit. If you made a mistake, it wasn't that big a deal. It was a very relaxed atmosphere, really a party type atmosphere. And I think probably the idea of doing the effects portion of the recording may have appealed to him as an interesting challenge. While I'm sure today I'm not ruining anybody's illusion that this was recorded at a swinging Beach Boy party, when it was actually recorded at Studios 2 and 3 of Western Recorders on Sunset in September of 1965. There was word apparently put around at the time that this was recorded at Mike Love's house, and I'm sure there were some fans who had arguments about the authenticity of this album. Now it doesn't matter, it's just the way that you would record an album like this. It's a fun conceit, nobody takes it seriously, but I think some of the fans might have felt a little bit deceived at the time. Marilyn Ravel Wilson has said that there actually was a session at Mike Love's house, which is, I suppose, vaguely possible that they did try to at least see if they could get an actual live recording at a party at somebody's home. But if so, none of those recordings seem to have ever materialized. For a long time, it was held that the recording sessions for the album took place on September 8th, 14th, 15th, 23rd, with the party effects being overdubbed at a session on September 29th. In 2015, the release of the 81-track Beach Boys Party Uncovered and Unplugged Sessions double CD revealed that there was an earlier session back on August 23rd, 1965, from which nothing was used on the final album. Some of the stuff had been bootlegged. We knew that there were a lot of outtakes around. I had no idea there was that much left in the can until this double CD was released, and we'll talk more about this in a future episode. As for the tracks on the final released album, they can be broken up roughly into about 4 categories. You get the early 60s party records, things like Hully Gully, which was a hit for the Olympics, number 72 in 1960. Papa Oomamau, a number 48 hit for the Rivingtons in 1962. Alley Oop, which had actually gone to number 1 in 1960 for the Hollywood Argyles. And of course, Barbara Ann from the Regents in 1961, which is a number 13 hit. Also later covered, of course, by Jan and Dean. Next, you get covers of Beatle records. Tell Me Why and I Should Have Known Better, of course, were from the Hard Day's Night soundtrack in 1964. You've Got to Hide Your Love Away was from earlier in 1965 from the Help soundtrack. This was probably an opportunity for the Beach Boys to cover the Beatles just to see what it would sound like. Not something that they would have done on one of their studio albums. Later on in 1968, they also did a cover of With a Little Help from My Friends, which remained unreleased at the time. Bruce Johnson said that that was something that was never really intended for inclusion on a Beach Boy album. It was just something that they did to see what it would sound like. Probably kind of an opportunity for them to do a similar thing here. I suppose we might also be able to make a category just for old favorites, things like Mountain of Love, which was a number 21 hit for the song's author, Harold Dorman, in 1960. Of course, that was also, as we mentioned, a hit for Johnny Rivers. It went to number 9 for him in 1964. Devoted to You, the B-side of the Everly Brothers' Bird Dog single in 1958, the oldest song on the album. There's No Other Like My Baby, which had been a number 20 hit for Phil Spector's The Crystals in 1961. And Bob Dylan's The Times They Are A-Changin' from 1964. Certainly the Phil Spector track was probably something Brian was eager to do with his love of Phil Spector's work. The Bob Dylan track gave a little showcase for folk fan Alan to indulge his interest in the folk scene. The inclusion of these tracks certainly helped vary the pace of the album, and a few weeks after the Beach Boys' Party album was released, There's No Other Like My Baby served as the B-side of the single The Little Girl I Once Knew, which is a song that deserves its own episode sometime in the future. Then finally you get the medley of hits, which actually just comprises 2 Beach Boy hits, I Get Around and Little Deuce Coupe. It's probably the loosest of the tracks here. Maybe this is because the band knew the material so well they could play it in their sleep. Maybe because it's their own material, they were less reverential toward it. Maybe doing irreverent takes on their own material was also meant to blunt possible criticism by fans of people like the Beatles and Bob Dylan, that by covering them in such a loose and relaxed manner, the Beach Boys were somehow making fun of them. So let's talk about the last track recorded for the album and the eventual single, Barbara Ann. As we mentioned, it was a number 13 hit for the Regents in 1961. In 1962, Jan and Dean had included their own version of it on the album Jan and Dean's Golden Hits. At the time, Dean says they wanted it released as a single, but Liberty Records refused. Famously, Dean is singing co-lead vocal with Brian on the Beach Boys released version of it, but how this came to be varies depending on who you talk to and when. In a 1971 interview, which was widely quoted elsewhere, Dean says that he and Jan were recording the single You Really Know How to Hurt a Guy in Studio 3 at Western Recorders. It was a song that Dean hated so much that he left the session, walked over to Studio 2 where the Beach Boys were recording, and participated in the recording of Barbara Ann. It's an interesting story. Unfortunately, the single You Really Know How to Hurt a Guy had been released in April of 1965. The Barbara Ann session was September 23rd, 1965, so the single had already been out for about 6 months before the Barbara Ann session. In the excellent Jan and Dean record book by Mark A. Moore, he says that on September 23rd, Jan and Dean were in Studio 3 of Western Recorders, actually working on cover versions of Everyone's Gone to the Moon and Let Me Be, which remained unreleased at the time, and the song Where Were You When I Needed You, which ended up on the Folk and Roll album. Session musician Bones Howe, who was in attendance at that session, says that Dean was just bored because there wasn't enough for him to do. Jan was running everything, so he just walked out and went down the hall to where the Beach Boys were. Mike and Bruce both say that there was a minor argument between Jan and Dean, and Jan had called a halt to the session, so during the break, Dean went down the hall and participated in Barbara Ann. Now, how they came to choose Barbara Ann is also interesting. Dean has at various times said that people suggested it because he was there and they associated Barbara Ann with him. He's also said that he suggested it himself, Brian Wilson said that Dean came in, he asked him for a suggestion, and Dean said Barbara Ann. Mike and Alan both say that they were getting ready to record Barbara Ann when, as a happy coincidence, Dean just happened to walk into the room. Yet another version of the story, told by people like engineer Chuck Britz, is that Jan was also in attendance either at this session or another of the Beach Boy party sessions. He didn't participate because they had specifically been threatened by Liberty Records that if they appeared on a Beach Boy record, Jan and Dean would have their royalties withheld. Dean, knowing he really shouldn't do it, went ahead and provided the cool, slightly off-key co-lead vocal with Brian that we hear on Barbara Ann. He says when the album came out and he heard the full album cut, with Carl very clearly saying thanks Dean at the end of the recording, he just about dropped dead. Dean has said the fact that he never got in trouble for this is evidence that record company executives actually didn't listen to the records. However, he's also said that there was talk about Jan and Dean appearing on the cover of Beach Boys Party, but that Liberty Record lawyers could never agree to terms. So I don't know how secret it really could have been if they were discussing putting Jan and Dean on the cover of the album. The album was completed and in stores in early November 1965, and plenty of time to catch the big holiday sales for the year. As we've seen, the album came in a lush gatefold package befitting the festive nature of the release. And it also originally came with this set of 15 fan club photos, which were perforated so you could break them up and carry them around in your wallet if you were so inclined. So sheets of this that haven't been broken up are relatively rare nowadays, and it's kind of a cool thing to have. Also, I had said in an earlier episode that the first time Bruce Johnston appeared on a Beach Boy album cover was on the Pet Sounds cover, and I realized I was mistaken about that. There's Bruce on the beach playing volleyball in these shots, and apparently all these beach volleyball shots were done the same day as the rest of the party album cover photos, because Mike, Bruce, Alan, and I think everybody else are all wearing the same shirts. I imagine that they didn't all dress exactly the same both days. They must have done the volleyball shots and the party shots at the same time. Though the album was born out of necessity, the Beach Boys seemed very happy with the result. And the album was very successful. It went to number 6 on the charts early in 1966. There would only be 3 more times in the Beach Boys' career when they would land an album of new material in the top 10, which would be Pet Sounds went to number 10 in 1966. 10 years later, 15 Big Ones would go to number 8 on the chart. And then in 2012, That's Why God Made the Radio went to number 3 on the chart. What was ahead of Beach Boys Party early in 1966 on the album chart in the US? At number 5, you had the Rolling Stones' December's Children and Everybody's, featuring the #1 hit, Get Off My Cloud. At number 4, you had Going Places by Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. At number 3, you had a comedy album called Welcome to the LBJ Ranch, which featured actual recordings of political figures of the day, such as Lyndon Johnson, Lady Bird Johnson, Robert Kennedy, Senator Everett Dirksen, all edited together for comic effect. At number 2 was the wildly popular soundtrack to the film The Sound of Music, and at number 1 was one of the big albums of the 1960s, Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass again, with Whipped Cream and Other Delights. Kind of amazingly, in the summer of 1966, 3 of the albums that held Pet Sounds back at the number 10 position were Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, still with Going Places, Whipped Cream and Other Delights, and at number 1 was their new album, What Now My Love. It's kind of hard to appreciate now just how huge Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass were on the album chart in the mid-1960s. But anyway, Capitol Records clearly believed strongly in the Beach Boys Party album. There was all kinds of promotion, there were in-store displays, there were ads on the radio. There was also apparently 1 million bags of Beach Boy Party potato chips given away at record stores. And I found this ad from Billboard magazine, November 6, 1965. Cap chips into Rush Party LP. Hollywood. First it was small Band-Aids promoting the Beatles' Help album. Now Capitol has devised tiny potato chip bags to help merchandise the Beach Boys Party album. The label expects to provide dealers with over 1 million potato chip bags, which carry a reproduction of the album cover. The chips will be placed in counter holders, 50 bags to a holder. As an added bonus to customers, the LP jacket contains 15 wallet-sized photos. And you can see this cool picture of Brian Wilson in a Hollywood record store. And there you see an actual Beach Boys party potato chip dispenser. I have seen the Help Band-Aids, but I've never actually seen one of these Beach Boy party potato chip bags. Now that would be a very cool collectible. If anybody's ever seen one or anybody has one, I'd love to see a photo of it or something. Really seems like an interesting and cool collectible to me. The single, Barbara Ann, did even better chart-wise, reaching number 2 on the US chart and number 3 on the UK chart, where it was the first big hit for the Beach Boys in England. It's often been talked about that Capitol Records promotion man Al Corey really believed in Barbara Ann, did a lot to promote it, finally convinced Capitol to go ahead and release it as a single, edited from 2 minutes 53 seconds down to 2 minutes and 5 seconds, and that the single was released without the knowledge of the Beach Boys. This may be true, but in his 2007 memoir, Capitol Records executive Ken Mansfield talks about this in a slightly different light. According to him, Brian Wilson was considered sort of an independent producer, and with his track record in 1965, they basically put out anything that Brian Wilson wanted put out. And that Brian Wilson had come to him with an acetate of Barbara Ann edited down as a single. He played it for Ken Mansfield, and Ken Mansfield went out on a limb and told him, hey, I think this is the wrong thing to do. It's a step backwards. It's really not in keeping with what you've been doing. Each record with the Beach Boys has been a progression. This is a big step backwards. I think it'll hurt your career. He says that Brian listened intently, stared him down, didn't say a word. Finally, he stood up, held the acetate above his head as he walked out the door, and Brian Wilson said, "This is our next single," and walked out. Ken Mansfield said that later he got a call from Beach Boys accountant, soon to be their manager, Nick Grillo, saying that he was no longer to have anything to do with promoting the Beach Boys. And of course, Ken Mansfield says that he stood corrected because obviously it was a super successful single. But it does kind of fly in the face of this thing that the Beach Boys didn't know it was going to be released as a single. So kind of wonder what happened there. Anyway, what kept the Beach Boys, Barbara Ann, away from the #1 spot? Well, there were 2 different songs. The first week, it was the Beatles' We Can Work It Out. The second week, they were shut out of the #1 spot by Petula Clark's My Love. The Beach Boys Party album certainly didn't push the boundaries of pop music the way some of the Beach Boys' other releases had in 1965, though in retrospect you can look at things like the party effects that are overdubbed as experimenting with non-musical sounds that would soon become such a part of the Smile album and of psychedelic music in general. And as music continued to expand, the same week that the Beach Boys Party reached #6 on the national chart, a new album entered at #60. The next week that album zoomed to #1, that album being the Beatles' Rubber Soul album. Of course, the Beach Boys would respond to this in some measure with the Pet Sounds album in the summer of 1966. The Party album certainly helped solidify and build the Beach Boys' public image. It remains a great listen, one of my favorite albums, really fun to listen to even to this day. Hope you enjoyed this. Please let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your comments. Love to hear if anybody knows any more about the Beach Boys Party promotional items, particularly those potato chips. If I've left anything out, if you have any other interesting insights, love to hear them. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again. Bye.